The word culture is interesting because it pre-existed anthropology. It was a word that was out there about 100 years ago, when anthropologists came on the scene, not too many people used this word. And it basically meant like theater, like people who went to plays and drank fancy drinks and went to museums, kind of like high culture. Or it could mean, as Guest puts it, it could mean these material goods and the stuff that was produced by a society. So it basically, I mean, if we look down at the Jaeger Museum of Art and Culture, it was that kind of stuff, and the kind of people that would go to such a place would think of themselves as cultured. So, but anthropologists took this word and they did something with it. What did they do, Amy? What does culture mean according to Guest and Anthropology now? Is it just material goods, artistic forms, drinking fancy drinks?
It's all of it.
True. And what else?
It's like it encompasses, I can't say all it, people's entire way of life. It's how they behave, it's how they go through life and everything in their perspective.
An entire way of life, you said, or Gus said. A system of knowledge, beliefs, patterns of behaviors, artifacts, and institutions. Yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to think about something that's not that. An entire way of life that are created, learned, shared, and contested by a group of people. There we have our full quote, Guest 2023, page 40. No, we'll just have a page number because who needs all that stuff? So, in more basic terms, that our lives are not just randomly led, that there are patterns to them, and that those patterns are going to be different in different places, different societies, different groups, a group of people, and historically different as well. So what's true now is probably not true 100 years ago in our own society and other societies. So we have this idea of an entire way of life, which is nevertheless particular to a group, a patterned way of life. Now, we want to, of course, be careful here to remember that culture is also all about borrowing and talking to other people. It's always been about that. It's always about getting ideas and trading them around and being connected. And you might refuse the ideas of a different group, or you might do different things with them, but people have always thought about themselves in relation to other groups. So this is not, we don't want to get into the idea that culture is this, this isolated thing in each group. People have always been talking to each other, but in general, we can say that there are patterns to the way those conversations develop. There are patterns to the customs and behaviors and the stuff that people make, and we can observe those patterns over time and in different places. Now, Guest uses an interesting word here at the end, which I just want to draw some attention to, that is perhaps something that in the earlier days of anthropology, we might not have talked about so much, the idea that these things are contested, that they're shared, that we share these things, but sometimes we share things that we like to argue about. And so, Tariq, you draw on the notion of, you used the notion of agency. I don't know if you remember human agency. What does agency mean? Yeah, I mean, it's the ability of people to do different things in the world. And so culture is not just something that gets imposed upon you and you have no choice. People are actively making and thinking about it and contesting it, right? And so this is not something that simply is given in the world. No, that's important enough, but perhaps more importantly, where do we get culture from? PJ, where do we get it from?
It's taught to us, and we can also just absorb it from those.
Yeah, we learn culture. So something that is taught to us and we absorb it. I mean, some of it is formally taught, but some of it we just soak up. What do we call this process, Katrina, when we're soaking up culture? What do anthropologists call that? Remember? Enculturation. So enculturation refers to just how even if you're not in school being taught things, you're absorbing things from your family, your peers, your elders, even people who are younger than you can change you. And we learn this process of culture. So what we see is that human life comes to us in patterns. Those patterns are learned, and it results in that each of us has, or each group, we might say, and maybe each of us has our own particular way of being human. That's how we become human. How old is this, Louisa? How deep is culture? How long ago, roughly?
We kind of it goes hand in hand with evolution in that sense, because we do the things that we
Yeah, I don't know either. But it's a hard question. I was asking, maybe it's the hardest question. When did culture begin? But you're right. Well, it's not the beginning of time. The beginning of time, I don't know when time began, but there weren't any people around. There have to be people, but it's intertwined with becoming human. So some people say it's 2.5 million years ago, because then you can see some stone tools in your favorite discipline of archaeology. You can find those stone tools. But honestly, it has to be older than that, because those are just the stone tools. People were probably using things that we can't find, because archaeology can't find everything, because it gets washed away and rots. If you're making a tool out of wood, then we can't find it after 3 million years. Yes.
Well, you could say that tools are the start of culture. Wouldn't you then be able to argue that some animals would have culture, because some animals can make tools as well?
I would certainly say that there are different groups of chimpanzees, and they learn different kinds of things. And so, but they learn some, but not to the extent that we've kind of taken it to extremes. I'm not gonna,
So how would you personally define like the start of culture?
well, I like to go back about 8 million years ago to when humans started walking around. Walking is learned behavior that we can't just learn. That's not from me. That's anthropologists that I like, but that's a little bit radical. Not everybody wants to go back to walking, but that's where I like to go. The point is, it's very deep in human evolution. It's very deep. You can go back, if you want to go back 2 million years or 100,000, it's what makes us, as Guest puts it, it is culture that has made us human. There isn't a human being where you can just strip back the culture part and be like, aha, we got a natural human being here. No such thing, because we become human in a particular way. Trina, you have a question or statement?
I think it would probably, I think in my mind, make the most sense to go back to like when there starts becoming evidence of humans kind of helping each other to survive and taking care of each other, like the elderly and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Like that implies that there's group sensibilities. It implies empathy, which a lot of people see as key to becoming human, the ability to see things from another person's perspective, being able to think about that. And so, you know, I mean, I don't, we can talk about this a lot, but I think the overall point is that goes back a long ways. It's fundamental to us, and it goes back, you know, hundreds of thousands, a million, maybe 50,000. I don't care. It's just a long, long, long time. It makes us human. So the way our patterns develop and the way we get enculturated feels to us natural. It starts to feel like, you know, the things that we're doing, but it's very important to understand that because it's learned, it can change and does change over time. And in some ways, you could say that culture is always changing from generation to generation or just within any given society. PJ, you said that we can unlearn culture. Really?
I mean, some people can consider like their religion to be their culture, and you can stop believing in that religion, or you can, you know, change or be born again and whatnot.
Yeah, I think so. Sorry, I was skeptical there, but yeah, you can think about what it is that you've grown up with and discard it, try to unlearn it. You might not be able to get it out of your system. I was raised in a very, very strong religious system, and you can try to unlearn it, but you know, it's harder to do. If you read Karl Marx, who's known as this firebrand atheist, it's very difficult to understand Karl Marx without understanding the Bible, because he had to read that too, right? So, you know, it's like, you know, but you can try, or you can, people change, right? They go to different place and they, you know, even when they're old, they learn other. It's usually easier if you're young. The younger you are, the better off you'll be in this process, but you can try. Yeah.
I slightly disagree with that because although you can change your beliefs and change to something else, what you were before will still have an impact on you, whether small or great.
Oh, for sure. You can't, you know, I mean, yeah. You're always going to be in midstream, but the point is you can try to adjust. You can think about your life and change it. You're not stuck. I mean, you are stuck, but you're not completely stuck, let us say. Now, I mean, this is in part because culture is contested, right? The things that we share are not all the same. And so one of the ways that people change is even within a society, you can go hang out with people who don't like that point of view. Right? You can decide, hey, I'm going to go with people who are not so into this religion or belief system that I want, and we'll be over there. So it's important to note here that, yes, of course, we're going to be affected by our past. We can't actually change the fact of where we started, but we're always in a dynamic situation, and we can try to exercise our human agency to various degrees to make it dynamic. So that is our first tool in anthropology, cultural anthropology, that is. The first tool, the first chapter was just an introduction, right? This must be part of the toolkit. Culture. So we'll call it the culture tool. The culture tool goes like this. Human life is patterned. Those pattern differences are primarily due to socially learned behavior. Now, I put primarily due to socially learned behavior because we don't want to forget about things like people are biologically different from each other. People live in different places, and sometimes it's rainy in some places, and sometimes, you know, so those things influence us. But the primary way that we learn or that we have human patterns is not based on our natural environment or our biology. We never want to forget about those things, but it's primarily our socially learned behavior. Oh, look, umbrellas. Maybe that's why I'm thinking of rain. So, you know, you can have this socially learned behavior and have an umbrella and put that up there, and then now you can walk along, shield yourself from the sun. So that's our first tool. How happy and excited are you to get the culture tool? Amy gave me a thumbs up. How, on a scale of 1 to 10, I should say, how happy are you? Excited. How exciting is this?
5.34.
Yeah, 5.3. Is anybody more excited than a 5.3? We can't do better than a 5.3 out of 10? That's not even passing. That's 53%. That's an F. I just got an F on my first culture tool.
Your sense of humor, so I'll give it a 5.6.
You'll give it a 5.6. Again, not even passing yet, as we demonstrated on the first day. We can't even get up to 6. We'll never make the Olympics with that. When they hold up those cards and gave you a 5.6, you might want to stop diving or whatever it is you're doing. That's not very exciting. Shaylin, you smiled. You're not happier than a 5.3 to 5.6?
I think I'll give you a.
Wow, I'm up to a 7. Oh my gosh. Yeah, not Elvis, not making the Olympics here, am I? 7s? 7's cool. No, man, if I'd gotten 7s for my whole life doing this, I'd have tried to do something else. Maybe I will. Huh. How we doing? Come on, Shaylin, you wouldn't have given it a 7 if I hadn't said that. What were you really thinking? All right, not you won't say. Yeah. See, I talked you into a 7 out of it was like a yeah, I was really trying. Yeah. All right. So the idea of culture, the tool of culture that we just got, is really not that exciting. In fact, I'm surprised we even got up to 5.3 or 5.6. And, you know, with a little guilt, I got you to 7, but no way, no. It's not that exciting. And there's a reason it isn't that exciting, because we've all heard it before. It's all around us. We probably hear the word culture maybe once a day. Like I said, 100 years ago, you didn't hear that word so much. But what I want to try and convince you of is it was more exciting 100 years ago. And it's most exciting if you think about what it's not supposed to be. So culture is really at its best. You would give it a 10 if it was an anti-concept. That is to say, it's against something else. Now, the idea of an anti-concept, I'm borrowing from Michel Rolf Trouillot, who was one of my person I took classes with in graduate school, sadly no longer with us, a Haitian American anthropologist, brilliant person, one of the smartest people I've ever met. And he talked about culture as this thing that worked against something else. So I didn't make this up. This idea was culture as an anti-concept. He wrote 2 brilliant essays on this, one of which is very well known in anthropology, called Anthropology and the Savage Slot, which is the idea that anthropology was assigned to study the people that were out there in the world who fell under this umbrella of people who were outside of the West. Now, again, he is not trying to call people names here. He's just saying where the intellectual tradition of anthropology came from. And then a kind of paired essay with that, which he called adieu culture or goodbye culture, which he was trying to say in some ways, what do we do with culture now that the word is everywhere? Okay, so what does he mean by culture as an anti-concept? As we know, anthropology as an academic discipline came around to us about 100 or 150 years ago. 1880s, around there, through the 1920s, some of the early anthropologists. There they are. Woo, anthropology comes in. And this is what Guest says. This is in your textbooks. You don't have to copy it down, but I wanted to talk about it. Remember how Guest said that this was a time, an earlier era of globalization, when the world was becoming smaller and more interconnected around this time. And so he says that more than ever before, Europeans, and that's generally where we get anthropology from, encountered the incredible, that should just be incredible, not incredibly, it should either be incredibly diverse or incredible diversity. One of those two. So typo in there from me. Of human cultures and appearances. Who are these people, they ask themselves? Where did they come from? Incredible diversity. Why do they appear so different from us? So this is what Guest says about how anthropology emerged as a kind of asking questions about the people the Europeans were encountering. The one thing that I want to qualify in there of what Guest is talking about is, don't forget the time period from around, those first voyages of the Spanish and Portuguese into the Americas through about 1800, the times when Potosi was producing so much silver that it was drowning the world in silver. And the world was, people were being dragged out of Africa into the plantations of the Americas in order to grow sugarcane to flavor that coffee and other things. All those things we talked about had already happened before any anthropologists came around. So it isn't simply that the Europeans were going out in a neutral way in, say, 1900 and encountering people for the first time. Those people had already been moved around in many cases. So the reason I don't want you to forget that is because as anthropology went out to try and ask these questions, they encountered a world which had already been shaped by this powerful hierarchy in which certain people were made to labor for others, were taken away from their country of origin. There had already been, massacres, genocides, all of those things. And so the world in which anthropologists first encountered others had already been interconnected and shaped by that hierarchy. So, but the question was, why are people different? For the Europeans and the North Americans, in a crude way, the question was, why are they like that? Now, how do you think people answered this question 100 or 150 years ago? Josie?
Well, a lot more environmental things than social things. They said, well, maybe it has to do with climate, maybe it has to do with temperature, maybe it has to do with, I don't know, social, the types of animals that live there, maybe that kind of stuff, rather than, social things like a lot more anthropologists would now.
Yeah, there was certainly a lot more geographical, what we call geographical determinism. So,
Yeah.
you know,
environmental
right,
determinism.
you know, like, oh, you know, they don't have seasons, so they can't think ahead. They don't have to plan anything because it's all the same all year round. Or, you know, in the places where you grow bananas, it's different than the places where you grow wheat, or it's too rainy there. You can't. So, you know, there were these sort of crude environmental answers. There was another answer, though, which is often linked to the environment, that is probably worse. Anybody other than Josie before I let Josie talk?
The question is asking why are people different, or the question is asking why are people treating people different?
The question was, why are other people different? Why these questions? Who are these people? Where did they come from? Why do they appear so different from us? Yeah.
Unfortunately, early anthropologists had theories that people of different ethnicities or races were completely different species.
Yeah, I mean, that was
They
basic.
evolved
I
differently.
guess I would say it wasn't just anthropologists. It was like that's what people thought.
Yeah.
So
that your race
right,
determined how you were biologically.
right. And again, this is not, I mean, I'm not talking here so much about environmental determinism, but these two ideas were often linked together. But for our purposes, let's just talk about the common answer to this was that your biology, your race, they didn't have the term genetics yet, but it's kind of the same thing, was determining of your capacity in the world, of your behavior. And that not only was it determined by your race, that obviously, since it was a biological given, that you weren't able to change that. Whatever you had, you had. Now, I remarked that the world in which people were looking at it by this time period was very hierarchical. But this was a very convenient idea, because if people are naturally different from each other,
Exploit the hell out of them.
that's the way things should be, right? So it justifies the hierarchies that existed in the world and had been made by human beings, but it's seen as this sort of natural plan or God's plan or evolution's plan, whatever it might be. And it also justifies the idea that our way is more correct and your way is wrong, etc. So when anthropologists got their shit together, you might say, and finally figured out that really culture was what determined, or culture was what made people different, then you could deploy that as an anti-concept against the idea of race, racial determinism. And so instead of this idea of having your life determined for you, that you would have this new thing that was dynamic, that changes and you could change. And that meant that those hierarchies weren't justified. They were actually wrong. They were morally unsupported, because why should your way of life be deemed more important for another person's way of life, if these were both learned patterns of behavior? So when Ruth Benedict came out with the book Patterns of Culture, it was, you know, it was a bestseller. It was a 10 out of 10, introducing this concept of culture into the world, because it was fighting against the idea of a racially determined hierarchy of peoples in the world, or an environmentally determined hierarchy of peoples in the world. And so, as I told you maybe in the first class, you know, this was like being able to get out there and fight for things. The purpose of anthropology is to make the world safe for human differences. So it wasn't just that we're cataloging different people. It wasn't just that we're studying different people. It's that we're trying to figure out how to make the world safe for this human difference that we're reporting on. So you can see that people kind of might have gotten excited about that. Maybe not everybody. Some people got mad. A lot of people got mad, in fact. But some people got excited. Whether you gave this a 10 or a 0, it was something that, you got excited about. The last time I taught this class, I taught a book by Charles King called Gods of the Upper Air. You can't read that, it's too small. How a circle of renegade anthropologists reinvented race, sex, and gender in the 20th century. So these renegade anthropologists out there, rebels fighting the world, people like Franz Boas, Ruth Benedict, Margaret Mead, Zora Neale Hurston is in this book as well, who's known now primarily as a novelist, but was actually studied with Franz Boas. And what King is arguing is that our ideas about race, about gender, about sex, and all those things we'll talk about, got reinvented by anthropologists about 100 years ago. Like I said, I talked about this. I assigned this book in the last class, and it's, we read that in a textbook, and nobody liked it. They didn't want to read this anymore. And you can read about these things on pages 50 to 51 of your textbook, where Guest talks about what he calls the historical development of the culture concept. And I thought nobody wanted to write about this because nobody had posted it on the web about it. So I figured, we wouldn't talk about this. Just like the last time I signed this book, nobody wanted to talk about it either. They preferred the textbook. But then just before the bell rang, a couple people talked about this section, so they're in trouble now. Let's see. Oh, Shaylin. Yeah. What did they think in the olden days? What was the idea of culture here that was first proposed?
Like cultural evolution, which basically instead of it was derived from Darwin's theory of evolution, so that, and people applied it to race or to different cultures, saying that like some were savages, some were more developed and stuff, and that it wasn't, that basically it was just like everyone was at different places of cultural evolution rather than being separate cultures.
Okay, so yes, this idea of unilineal or unilinear, maybe. No, it's just this idea that everybody's on a ladder, right? Or everybody's going in one direction, and some people are way back. They got to catch up. Maybe they can't catch up, or we can catch them up, but they were all on the same path. This idea that evolution, which by the way is wrong biologically, evolution doesn't work that in the biological world either, but it was applied to the social world. And so the idea is you can rank people, and people are, this by race or environment, and we have to get them up until we have Franz Boas and a different idea, Katrina, what? Another big word, remember? I'm always asking for the big words, sorry. It's a little bit of an odd word. Something particularism, yeah. It's historical particularism, which sounds kind of weird, but it just basically means there isn't like one track. Everybody's there on their own, doing their own thing, and some people are going this way and some people are going that way. Ruth Benedict in Patterns of Culture called it a great arc, kind of like a great rainbow. And the people kind of were, they weren't comparable in this sense of, they're not on the same, not everybody's on the same track. So, if you're really into the history of this, that's where it is. Like I said, most people don't care so much about it, but the point of the matter is that this was really exciting back in the day, because anthropologists were using this idea to fight against some very awful ideas about human beings and the potential of other human beings and whether people could, and so some people got very excited about this. Don't take this book cover literally. We talked about Margaret Mead, but this person wrote a book, Margaret Mead made me gay, which is She's not really, but you know, the idea is, hey, because of anthropology, we can think differently about our sexuality, our identity, what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a man, all those things, what it means to more than two genders, etc. Can't tell, Shaylin, is your hand raised or that's just a comfortable position?
So they said in the book that the first one was originally made because didn't he want to combat racism with that? Or something, was that, it was something like that, which is interesting because of what it suggests, but.
Right, I
was
mean,
gonna ask about that, I thought that was.
yeah, no, I mean, I think that, you know, Franz Boas was a Jewish immigrant from Germany during a time when, you know, anti-Semitism was on the rise. And, you know, he saw his research and his studies as allied to this idea of, you know, fighting the, in some ways, the anti-Semitism and the racism of the time. And so, you know, the people, you know, I don't want to say they were beautiful or perfect. They made, you know, a whole lot of other things that we could say about them, but they saw themselves as positioned against the dominant ideas in US society. They saw themselves as renegades, as rebels against the predominant views, and as giving us a different way to think about life. So that in fact, that yes, that in some ways, the unilineal cultural evolution was in fact a racist scheme of ideas about how people go through history, and that historical particularism, or just what we might call a more cultural relativism, would be able to was not only a more accurate vision of society, but would also result in change for the United States and the world.